Welcome to the Book Voices channel. If you enjoy our content, don't forget to like and subscribe to stay updated with our latest book discussions. Now let's dive into today's book.
All right, so have you ever wondered what school teachers and sumo wrestlers could possibly have in common?
Not really, no. I mean, they seem like pretty different professions, right?
Exactly. That's what makes Freakonomics, the book we're diving into today, so fascinating.
Oh, Freakonomics. Yeah, I've heard of that.
It's Freakonomics. A rogue economist explores the hidden side of everything by Stephen D. Levitt and Stephen J. Dubner.
Okay, that sounds intriguing. What's so rogue about their approach?
Well, they don't just stick to traditional economic topics. They use data and economic principles to explore all sorts of unexpected areas.
I'm starting to see why you brought up school teachers and sumo wrestlers.
You got it. And that's what we'll unpack in this deep dive. You can think of it as a crash course in Freakonomics, getting straight to those surprising insights.
Like a cheat sheet for understanding the world a little differently.
Yeah, exactly. Whether you're the kind of person who loves to impress everyone at dinner parties with your knowledge,
Or you just genuinely enjoy learning new things and seeing things from a fresh perspective.
this is for you. So, to give you a little background, the book uses a really wide range of sources, from hard data analysis to real-world observations.
And it all boils down to this really interesting contrast between how we think the world works, based on morality,
Right.
versus how it actually works, which is often driven by incentives.
Hidden incentives a lot of the time.
Exactly.
So, that's our mission today. Uncovering those unexpected connections, challenging conventional wisdom, and getting to the bottom of how incentives shape everything around us.
Sounds good to me. Where do we start?
Let's jump right in with what Levitt and Dubner consider the driving force behind so much of human behavior.
Incentives.
Right, makes sense. They argue that incentives, whether they're financial, social, or even moral, are really at the heart of why we do what we do.
It's like we're all constantly weighing the potential costs and benefits, even if we're not always consciously aware of it.
That's a great way to put it. And a perfect example of this is something as commonplace as anti-smoking campaigns.
Oh, interesting. How's
Well, you've got the economic incentive of higher cigarette prices through taxes, right?
Yeah, that's a pretty direct hit to the wallet.
Then there's the social incentive, where public smoking bans make it less socially acceptable to light up.
Making it less cool, less appealing.
Exactly. And then you add a moral layer, where governments might link those cigarette taxes to funding healthcare or anti-smoking initiatives.
So you're hitting people's sense of right and wrong on top of the economic and social pressures.
It's a multi-pronged approach, all aimed at steering behavior.
Smart.
But here's where it gets really interesting. The book points out that even well-intentioned incentives can have unintended consequences.
Uh-oh, I'm sensing a story here.
Absolutely. They talk about blood donations, which seems like a purely altruistic act, right?
Yeah, you're giving something of yourself to help others.
So you'd think offering a small payment would encourage more people to donate, right?
Makes sense on the surface.
But as it turns out, the data showed the opposite. When a small stipend was introduced, donations actually went down.
Let's see.
Seriously, it seems that introducing even a small financial reward shifted people's perception.
Like it took away from the pure act of giving and turned it into a transaction.
That's it exactly. And for many potential donors, that small payment wasn't enough to outweigh the, the inconvenience or
The egg factor.
yeah, maybe the ick factor. So it's a great example of how even a seemingly positive incentive can backfire.
It really highlights the complexity of human behavior.
Doesn't it? And it makes you think, are there other areas where we're trying to motivate people using the wrong incentives?
I'm sure there are.
Yeah.
And speaking of unexpected consequences, the book has this amazing example called The Mystery of the Vanishing Children.
I love this one. It shows how even a tiny change in incentives can expose a huge amount of hidden behavior.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
For years, claiming dependence on your taxes was simple.
You just listed their names, right?
That's it. But then the government made a small change. They started requiring Social Security numbers for each dependent.
Seems like a reasonable request.
Yeah, but here's the thing. Suddenly, millions of children vanished from tax returns.
Millions. How many millions are we talking?
7 million? Poof, gone. These so-called phantom children just disappeared.
Wow. That's a lot of creative accounting going on.
It really was. And it shows how even a seemingly minor tweak to the system can reveal just how much people are willing to, shall we say, bend the rules.
When the incentives are right.
Or, in this case, wrong, And it makes you wonder what other kinds of hidden behaviors are lurking beneath the surface, just waiting for the right incentive to bring them to light.
So if even something as seemingly straightforward as taxes can be gamed, what about something like high-stakes testing in education? Those scores have huge consequences for schools and teachers.
You're right on the money. And Freakonomics dives deep into this, looking at how incentives can lead to cheating, even in a field that's supposed to be about, integrity and learning.
Yeah, it's a bit disheartening to think about.
It is. Of course, there are the blatant cases, like the teacher who literally wrote the answers on the chalkboard for the students.
Oh, come on, really?
Really? But what the book really focuses on are the more subtle and potentially much more widespread ways teachers might try to boost scores.
I'm guessing subtle doesn't mean less effective?
Not at all. We're talking about things like giving students extra time on exams,
Okay.
or trying to get a sneak peek at the test questions beforehand.
Sneaky.
Right. Or even focusing on the harder questions at the end of the exam, maybe anticipating which ones students are likely to get wrong and giving them a little nudge in the right direction.
So it's not outright cheating, but more like bending the rules to give their students an edge.
Exactly. And it highlights how strong the pressure can be when those test scores are tied to things like school funding, teacher evaluations, or even job security.
It creates a very real incentive to, well, to cut corners.
But how do you even begin to detect something like that, especially if it's happening on a large scale and in subtle ways?
That's a good question. I'm assuming they have some ideas about this.
Oh, they absolutely do. This is where the rogue economist approach really comes in.
Lay it on me.
Levitt and his colleagues developed these statistical tools to look for unusual patterns in classroom answer sheets.
Like, what kind of patterns are we talking about?
Things like large blocks of identical answers, especially on those harder questions at the end.
It does sound a bit fishy.
The thinking is bright students might all get the easy questions right, but it's statistically improbable for a bunch of struggling students to all magically get the hardest questions correct.
Unless someone is helping them along.
Bingo. So these unusual patterns become a red flag, a sign that something might be amiss.
Okay, so they have these statistical tools, but can they actually tell which classrooms are cheating just by looking at the numbers?
That's a great question, and they actually include a little spot the cheater exercise in the book.
Oh, interesting. How does it work?
They show you answer sheets from two classrooms, Classroom A and Classroom B, and you have to try to figure out which one has the cheating teacher just by looking at the patterns of student answers.
I'm guessing it's harder than it sounds.
It really is. It's incredibly difficult to tell just by eyeballing it.
So it's not something you could just spot intuitively.
Not at all. And that's why they developed what they call a cheating algorithm.
Now we're talking. An algorithm to catch the cheaters.
Exactly. It's not about singling out individual students. It's
Right.
about identifying classrooms where the overall answer patterns are statistically way too improbable to be genuine.
Like, it would be so unlikely to happen by chance that it raises a serious red flag.
Exactly. It's like a basketball team where suddenly everyone starts making three-pointers blindfolded.
Yeah, you'd have to suspect something's up.
And to be extra sure, they looked at what happened when these suspect classrooms were retested.
So a pop quiz to see if the magic still worked?
Pretty much. And guess what? The scores often drop significantly in the retest.
Busted. So the initial high scores were likely due to, well, some external assistance.
It seems so. And to further validate their findings, they compared these classrooms to a control group.
Classrooms where there was no suspicion of cheating.
Right. Classrooms with teachers who had a proven track record of strong student improvement.
The gold standard.
Exactly. And the control groups consistently maintained their high performance in the retest.
So it wasn't just a fluke or some weird testing anomaly.
Nope. It really seems like the cheating algorithm was onto something.
Impressive. So what you're saying is, data analysis can be a powerful tool for uncovering hidden behaviors, even in areas like education where it's really hard to prove wrongdoing definitively.
Absolutely. And this idea that incentives can lead to unexpected consequences, even in fields where we might assume integrity reigns supreme, well, it doesn't stop at education.
Right. We were talking about sumo wrestlers earlier.
Exactly. The book touches on cheating in sports, even making a distinction between athletes who cheat to win.
Which I guess you could almost understand, though it's still wrong.
Yeah, there's that drive for victory, however misguided it might be.
But then you have athletes who cheat to lose.
Like in the Black Sox scandal, where players intentionally threw the World Series.
That's just baffling. Why would anyone do that?
Well, it often comes down to gambling, bribes, things like that. The incentives are completely different.
Greed over glory.
In a nutshell. And believe it or not, they even touch on the alleged rigging of beauty pageants.
Seriously.
It's true, suggesting that even those seemingly subjective competitions can be influenced by hidden agendas and personal connections.
So nowhere is safe from the power of incentives.
It seems not. But let's get back to those sumo wrestlers. That's a really fascinating case study in how incentives can lead to unexpected behaviors in a very specific and insular world.
Okay, remind me what makes sumo wrestling so unique.
Well, it's a small, very tight-knit community. Tournaments are held every 2 months, and there's a very rigid ranking system.
So your reputation and your standing within that community are everything.
You got it. And that creates some really interesting incentives for the wrestlers.
Like what?
They focus on wrestlers who have a 7-7 win-loss record going into the final day of a tournament.
Okay, so they're right on the edge.
Right on the bubble. One more win secures their ranking and, more importantly, their future earning potential.
High stakes.
Very high. Now, their opponent in that final match might have an 8-6 record.
So they've already secured a winning record.
Exactly. They have less riding on this particular match.
I'm starting to see where this is going.
It creates a situation where it might actually be in both wrestlers' best interest for the 7-7 wrestler to win.
Like a wink, wink, nudge, nudge kind of deal.
So you got it. The 8-6 wrestler might be more willing to, shall we say, cooperate.
To ensure the 7-7 wrestler keeps their ranking and potentially return the favor in the future.
It's all about maintaining the stability of the system and fostering those long-term relationships within the sumo world.
Okay, that makes sense from a strategic standpoint, but do they have any evidence that this actually happened?
Oh, they have data. They found that 7-7 wrestlers had a significantly higher win rate against 8-6 opponents on those crucial final days.
Compared to other matchups.
Exactly. And what's even more telling is that after allegations of match fixing surfaced and stricter monitoring was put in place.
That win rate dropped significantly, right?
You know it. It's pretty hard to explain that away as just random chance.
So it seems like the increased scrutiny changed the incentives, making those cooperative wins less likely.
It really does point to some shady dealings going on behind the scenes.
Even in a sport that prides itself on tradition and honor.
It's a reminder that those individual incentives, especially when they're strong enough, can sometimes trump even the most deeply held cultural values.
Okay, so we've gone from cheating teachers to sumo wrestling scandals. What other unexpected areas do they explore?
Well, how about something a little more mundane but equally revealing? Bagels. The book tells the story of the bagel man, Paul Feldman, and his accidental experiment in everyday honesty.
Bagels. I gotta hear.
Feldman started this simple honor system bagel delivery business.
So, like, he just dropped off bagels and trusted people to pay.
That's it. He'd leave a tray of bagels and a money can at different companies and just, hope for the best.
What could go wrong?
Well, it turns out his meticulous record keeping.
He tracked everything.
Everything. How many bagels were taken, how much money was collected, the whole 9 yards.
So he inadvertently created this massive data set on human honesty.
Or dishonesty, as the case may be.
Okay, I'm hooked. What did the bagel data reveal?
First off, it gave him a pretty good gauge of overall honesty levels in different workplaces.
I bet that varied quite a bit.
Oh, it did. And what's really interesting is he noticed variations based on things like company culture, the weather.
The weather, really?
Yeah. Even things like office morale seem to have an impact.
So people are more likely to steal a bagel if they're having a bad day?
It seems that way. And there was one case where employees on a higher executive floor, the bigwigs.
The ones making the big bucks.
Exactly. They actually had a slightly lower payment rate than those on the lower floors.
That's counterintuitive. You'd think the higher-ups would be more, ethical.
You'd think so, right. It makes you wonder if there's something about power or perceived status that
That makes people feel a little less accountable, maybe.
Maybe so. But the big takeaway here is that what we consider crime or dishonesty can be very context-dependent.
Like taking a bagel from the office break room feels different than, say, walking out of a restaurant without paying.
Totally different. It's about the perceived stakes and the social norms in play.
It's like a sliding scale of what's acceptable, even if it's technically wrong.
Exactly. So the bagel man's data, even though it seems kind of silly, gives us a glimpse into the complexities of human behavior and how our moral compass can be surprisingly flexible.
I'm starting to see why Freakonomics is so popular. It takes these everyday things and turns them into thought-provoking insights.
That's the beauty of it. Okay, ready to shift gears to another powerful force that shapes behavior.
Hit me.
It's called information asymmetry.
Okay, that sounds a bit technical. Break it down for me.
It's the idea that in any transaction or interaction, one party might have more relevant information than the other.
Like insider knowledge.
Exactly. And the book argues that this imbalance of information can be a huge source of power.
Meaning, the person with more information can use it to their advantage.
You got it. And they illustrate this with a really stark example. The Ku Klux Klan.
Wow, okay, that took a dark turn.
It did, but it's a powerful illustration. They argue that a big part of the KKK's power, historically, came not just from their violence,
Right.
but from their secrecy.
The hidden rituals, the unknown identities, all of that.
That's it. It created this atmosphere of fear and intimidation, amplified by the fact that outsiders knew so little about them.
So the lack of information actually made them seem even more powerful and dangerous.
Exactly. It's like, the less you know, the more you fear.
And the more power they have over you.
But what's interesting is that when people started revealing the Klan's secrets, demystifying their rituals...
Like pulling back the curtain.
Exactly. It took away a lot of their power.
Because it wasn't so scary anymore.
Right. It wasn't this mysterious, all-powerful force anymore.
So knowledge really is power, in a way.
It can be. And the book draws a parallel between the KKK and other groups who use information asymmetry, though in far less sinister ways.
Like who?
Think about real estate agents, politicians, even stockbrokers.
They all have specialized knowledge that most people don't.
Right. They're the experts, and that expertise gives them an advantage in negotiations and dealings.
It's like they know the rules of the game better than anyone else.
And they can use that knowledge to their advantage.
Okay, so how does this play out in the real world? Any specific examples?
They talk about the dramatic drop in life insurance prices in the late 1990s.
Insurance isn't exactly the most exciting topic.
I know, but stick with me. This is a great example of what happens when information becomes more readily available.
Okay, I'm listening.
Before the internet, you pretty much had to rely on insurance agents to get quotes and compare prices.
So they had all the information.
They did. But then the internet came along, and suddenly consumers could compare prices from multiple companies with just a few clicks.
It leveled the playing field.
Totally. The insurance companies lost their informational advantage, and prices went down as a result.
So increased transparency can benefit consumers.
Absolutely. And here's another everyday example. That one-day-old car losing a significant chunk of its value.
Yeah, I've heard about that. Why does that happen?
It all comes down to perceived information, or rather, the lack of it.
Explain.
A potential buyer sees that a brand new car is being sold so quickly and thinks, there must be something wrong with it.
Even if there isn't.
Right. They don't have all the information, so they assume the worst.
And that lack of information creates a perception of risk, which drives the price down.
It's a classic example of information asymmetry at play.
So we need to be careful about making assumptions when we don't have the full picture.
Exactly. And this applies to so many areas of life.
They touch on corporate scandals like Enron too, right?
They do. And they even bring up the medical field, where there can be debates about the effectiveness of certain treatments.
Yeah, like when doctors recommend procedures that might not actually be necessary.
Right. It's all about who has the information and how they use it.
They even share that anecdote about someone trying to haggle with a real estate agent over the price of a house.
Oh, yeah. And the agent was practically offended by the lowball offer.
It was like personal insult.
Because to the agent, they had all this insider knowledge about the market that the buyer didn't.
So they felt like they were in a much stronger position.
And they were, and they used that informational advantage to try to get the best deal for themselves and for their client, of course.
I see. So information asymmetry is everywhere.
It really is. And the book encourages us to be aware of it, both in our own lives and in the larger world.
Makes sense. Okay, so we've covered incentives, information asymmetry. What else is there?
Well, building on this idea of hidden truths and how to uncover them, they get into the really tricky issue of testing for hidden bias.
Hidden bias, like prejudice that people might not even be aware of themselves.
Exactly. And it can be really hard to measure.
Because people might not want to admit to their biases, even to themselves.
That's right. And they start with this really compelling example. The Trent Lott controversy.
Refresh my memory on that one.
Trent Lott was a senator who made some seemingly innocuous comments at a birthday party for Strom Thurmond.
Strom Thurmond, the segregationist senator.
That's the one. And Lott's comments, while maybe not intentionally malicious, sparked a huge backlash and ultimately led to his resignation.
Because they reveal these underlying biases that a lot of people found deeply offensive.
Exactly. It showed how even seemingly offhand remarks can betray deep-seated prejudices.
So words matter.
They really do. And then, in a totally unexpected twist, they turned to the game show The Weakest Link as a laboratory for studying discrimination.
The weakest link.
Ah.
The one where they vote each other off and Ann Robinson insults everyone.
That's the one. And what made it so interesting for studying bias is that the contestants had to publicly justify their votes.
So even if their reasons were strategic, they might also reveal underlying prejudices.
That's the idea. By analyzing who got voted off when and the patterns in the voting, they could look for statistical evidence of discrimination based on things like age, gender, or race.
So it's like you can learn something about societal biases from a game show.
Exactly. It's all about finding data in unexpected places.
I like their style.
And they didn't stop there. They also discuss an online dating experiment where people's stated preferences for partners didn't always match up with who they actually responded to.
So what people say they want and what they actually go for might be two different things.
That's it. And it often reflected existing societal stereotypes about attractiveness and desirability.
That's food for thought.
It is. And they also touch on political races, like the David Dinkins mayoral race in New York City and David Duke's Senate run in Louisiana.
Two very different candidates.
Very different. But in both cases, the pre-election polls significantly underestimated the support for the white candidates,
Suggesting that some voters might have been reluctant to reveal their true preferences to pollsters.
It highlights the challenges of measuring hidden biases through traditional methods like surveys.
People might not always tell the whole truth, especially when it comes to sensitive topics.
Exactly. And it's all tied into this idea of conventional wisdom.
What do they mean by that?
It's those widely held beliefs that we often take as truth, but which might not actually be supported by evidence.
Like common sense isn't always so common.
Exactly. And they use the example of Listerine, the mouthwash.
Okay, what about Listerine?
Well, before Listerine, bad breath wasn't really seen as a huge social problem.
It was just bad breath.
But Listerine came along and basically invented the concept of halitosis.
Making it sound like a medical condition.
Right. They turned a minor issue into a major social fear through clever marketing.
And made a ton of money in the process.
They did. And it shows how easily our perceptions can be shaped by advertising and how those perceptions can become conventional wisdom, even if they're not based on reality.
So we need to be critical thinkers and question what we're told, even if it seems like everyone believes it.
Absolutely. Okay, ready for a completely different kind of hidden world?
Bring it on.
The book delves into Sudhir Venkatesh's incredible and somewhat accidental immersion into the world of a Chicago crack gang.
A sociologist studying a crack gang.
That's it. But it went way beyond a typical research project.
How so?
Venkatesh was initially trying to conduct a survey, but he ended up spending years embedded with the gang.
Years.
Years. He gained this unprecedented insider's view of their operations and their lives.
I bet that was eye-opening.
It was, and what he found was far from the stereotypical image of a glamorous, highly profitable criminal enterprise.
So it wasn't all fast cars and stacks of cash.
Not for most of them. They had a surprisingly hierarchical structure, almost like a legitimate corporation.
With a CEO and a board of directors.
Pretty much. They had a leader at the top, like JT in the book.
Okay.
And then a board of directors who made decisions.
And then the foot soldiers.
Hundreds of them. But here's the crazy part. Most of those foot soldiers were making hardly any money.
Seriously?
Seriously. They were often living with their mothers and actually aspired to what they considered good jobs.
Like regular 9-to-5 jobs.
Exactly. Things like being a janitor or working in a factory.
So the reality of being a low-level gang member was a lot less glamorous than the perception.
It was. And the book uses this analogy of life as a tournament to explain why so many young men were willing to take on this incredibly risky and poorly paid job.
Like they're all competing for a chance at the top, even though the odds are stacked against them.
Exactly. They see those few guys at the top who are making real money and think, maybe I can be one of them.
It's like the lottery. A tiny chance of winning big, but most people end up losing.
It's a perfect analogy. Now, the guys at the top, like JT, were indeed making bank.
So someone was benefiting from all this.
And what's interesting is that JT was actually a very shrewd businessman.
He ran the gang like a legitimate enterprise.
He did. He had this whole corporate-style bookkeeping system going on.
Organized crime, literally.
It's a fascinating contrast to the chaos and violence that surrounds the lower-level members.
So even in the criminal world, there are those who thrive by applying business principles.
It seems so. And the book makes this really interesting comparison between the invention of crack cocaine and the invention of nylon stockings.
Now that's an unusual pairing.
I know, right? But their point is that both were revolutionary products that spread like wildfire and had a huge impact on society.
Though obviously with very different consequences.
Right. Crack cocaine obviously had a devastating impact, particularly on Black communities.
They argue that it caused more harm than any single factor since Jim Crow.
And they cite the quadrupling of homicide rates among young urban Blacks during the crack epidemic as evidence.
And it's a stark reminder of the dark side of innovation.
It is. Okay, ready for one of the most debated and surprising parts of the book?
I'm on the edge of my seat.
It's the great crime drop of the 1990s.
The one where crime rates plummeted across the U.S.
That's it. And it was largely unexpected, which of course sent experts scrambling for explanations.
I bet they had plenty of theories.
Oh, they did. Some pointed to the strong economy of the 90s.
Seems logical.
Yeah, but the book points out that crime actually went up during the booming economy of the 1960s.
So that theory doesn't quite hold up.
Not really. Others pointed to increased gun control measures.
Makes sense on the surface.
But the book argues that the sheer number of existing guns meant that new laws probably had a relatively small impact overall.
Okay, what about those innovative policing strategies, like the broken windows theory and all that?
Well, those were definitely credited with reducing crime in some cities, like New York, but crime rates fell pretty much everywhere in the 90s, even in cities with very different approaches to policing.
So there must have been something else going on at a larger scale.
Exactly. They even looked at capital punishment and found that it likely had a minimal deterrent effect.
Surprising.
So if those aren't the main reasons, what does Freakonomics propose?
Well, they offer a couple of more intriguing and definitely more controversial theories.
First up is what they call the bursting of the crack bubble.
Meaning the crack epidemic was waning.
Exactly. As the price of crack cocaine fell, so did the huge profits that were fueling all that gang violence.
So less money to fight over, less incentive for violence.
That's the idea. They estimate that this could account for a significant chunk of the overall crime drop.
Interesting. But they have an even more provocative theory, right?
They do, and it's the one that really gets people talking. They suggest that the legalization of abortion with Roe v. Wade in 1973 played a major role in the crime drop.
Whoa, how so?
Their argument is that legalized abortion led to a decrease in unwanted births, and that children born into difficult circumstances are statistically more likely to be involved in crime later in life.
It's a tricky argument. I can see why that would be controversial.
It's incredibly controversial, and they're
Yeah.
very careful to acknowledge that this is a complex issue with lots of factors at play.
Right, it's not a simple cause and effect relationship.
Not at all. They're not saying that every child born into poverty will become a criminal, or that abortion is the sole reason for the crime drop.
But they're suggesting that it had a significant demographic impact.
Exactly. And they point to the timeline, noting that the big crime drop happened roughly a generation after Roe v. Wade.
And that states that legalized abortion earlier saw crime rates decline sooner.
Right. So while it's impossible to say for certain, they present a pretty compelling case for at least considering this as a contributing factor.
It definitely makes you think about the potential long-term consequences of social policies in a whole new light.
It does. Okay, ready to tackle another area where conventional wisdom often reigns supreme?
Sure, fire away.
It's parenting. The book asks this fundamental question. How much do parents really matter in shaping their children's outcomes?
That's a question every parent asks themselves at some point.
It is, and there's been a big shift in recent years, from a more intuitive approach to parenting to a more data-driven one.
With all these experts telling us the right way to raise our kids.
And the book points out that those experts often have incentives to, well, to create a little parental anxiety.
Because that's what sells books and parenting programs.
You got it. They want us to believe that every little decision we make will have a huge impact on our children's future.
Which, let's be honest, can be pretty overwhelming.
It can be. And to illustrate this, they present a statistic that's bound to surprise you. Swimming pools are statistically more dangerous for children than guns.
Whoa. Really? That's counterintuitive.
It is, but it highlights how our perception of risk is often skewed by things like media coverage and emotional reactions.
We might worry more about the things that are less likely to actually harm us.
Exactly. Now, the book dives into some really interesting research that challenges traditional thinking about parenting.
Like what?
They talk about the Colorado Adoption Project, which followed hundreds of adopted children over many years.
What do they find?
Well, it suggested that while parents certainly have some influence, factors like genetics and peer groups.
This marks the end of part 1 of our book discussion. If you enjoyed the content, let us know in the comments. Your feedback will help us decide when to share part 2.